The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the trading post, and Catherine Sullivan stepped down into the dust of Green River, Wyoming territory, clutching nothing but the worn dress on her back and the letter that had brought her 2,000 miles west from Philadelphia. The year was 1882, and the September sun blazed overhead as Catherine scanned the handful of buildings that comprised this frontier settlement. She had expected little, but the reality was somehow more stark than imagination had prepared her for. A general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with peeling paint, and a few scattered structures that seemed to huddle together against the vast emptiness of the Wyoming landscape. Behind the town, mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already touched with early snow. Looking for someone, miss? The stagecoach driver asked, hauling mail bags down from the roof. Yes, Catherine said, her voice steadier than her nerves. I am looking for Yates Randolph. He owns a ranch near here. The driver nodded knowingly, and Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. Of course he knew. Everyone in these small towns knew everything about everyone. They knew she was a mail-order bride, arriving to marry a man she had never met, a man whose 3 letters over the past 4 months were all she knew of his character. The Randolph place is about 5 miles north, the driver said, not unkindly. He usually comes into town on Saturdays for supplies. That would be today, so he might be along shortly. Catherine thanked him and moved into the shade of the trading post's awning. The other passengers dispersed, greeted by loved ones or heading into the saloon. She stood alone, suddenly aware of how completely she had severed herself from everything familiar. Her parents were dead these 3 years past, victims of typhoid. Her aunt, with whom she had lived since, had made it clear that Catherine was a burden she could no longer afford to bear. When Catherine had seen the advertisement in the newspaper, seeking a wife for a Wyoming rancher, she had responded more out of desperation than hope. Yet Yates Randolph's letters had surprised her. They were simple, honest, and revealed a man who was lonely but decent. He had been forthright about the hardships of ranch life, about the isolation and the work. He had promised nothing except respect and a home. Catherine had asked for nothing more. She waited an hour, watching the sparse traffic of Green River's Main Street. A wagon loaded with barrels, 2 cowboys on horseback, dusty from the trail, a woman in a faded calico dress carrying a basket. Then she heard the sound of hoofbeats and turned to see a man riding a sturdy bay horse, leading a pack mule behind him. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a battered hat that shaded his face. As he drew closer, Catherine saw he was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of beard darkening his jaw. He dismounted with an easy grace and tied both animals to the hitching post before turning to scan the street. Their eyes met, and Catherine saw surprise flicker across his face, followed by something she could not quite read. He removed his hat and approached slowly as though she might startle like a wild creature. "Miss Sullivan?" he asked. His voice was deep, roughened by wind and weather, but gentle. "Yes, Mr. Randolph, Yates," he said. "Just Yates." He stood there, turning his hat in his hands, and Catherine realized he was as nervous as she was. The thought was oddly comforting. She studied him in the bright afternoon light. He had a strong face, weathered by sun and honest work, with gray eyes that looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something solid about him, something that spoke of reliability and strength. "I hope your journey was not too difficult," he said finally. "It was long," Catherine admitted, "but I am here." "Yes." He seemed at a loss for words, then gestured toward the general store. "I need to collect my supplies, then we can head to the ranch, unless you need anything from the store." Catherine looked down at her dress, the same one she had worn for the last 3 days of travel. "I do not have any money, Mr. Randolph. Yates. I spent the last of what I had on meals during the journey." He frowned slightly, his gaze taking in her appearance for the first time, really looking at her. "You do not have any bags, a trunk?" "No." The admission cost her pride, but there was no point in pretending. "I have nothing. This dress and the shoes on my feet, that is all." The silence stretched between them, and Catherine felt the weight of her poverty like a physical thing. She waited for disappointment to cloud his features, for regret to set in. She had been honest in her letters, but perhaps he had not truly understood just how destitute she was. Instead, Yates stepped closer and did something that stunned her. He took her hand gently, his calloused fingers warm against hers, and looked directly into her eyes. "Then everything I own is yours," he said simply. The words were not flowery or dramatic. They were stated as plain fact, as though he were commenting on the weather or the price of cattle. But the sincerity in his gray eyes made Catherine's throat tighten with emotion. "You do not have to say that," she managed. "I am not saying it because I have to," Yates replied. "I am saying it because it is true. If you are going to be my wife, then what is mine is yours. We will get you what you need." He released her hand and turned toward the general store, leaving Catherine to follow. Inside the dim, cluttered space that smelled of leather and tobacco and coffee, Yates moved with purpose. The proprietor, a balding man with spectacles, greeted him cheerfully. "Afternoon, Yates. Got your usual order ready?" "Thank you, Homer. But first, I need to get some things for Miss Sullivan here. She will be my wife." Homer's eyebrows rose, but he was quick to offer congratulations. Yates barely acknowledged them, already moving through the store. He pulled bolts of fabric from shelves, holding them up for Catherine's approval. Cotton for work dresses, a length of wool for something warmer. A brush and comb, a small mirror, hairpins. A warm coat that had probably been ordered by someone else but never collected. Sturdy boots that would hold up better than her worn city shoes. Undergarments, which he handed to her without embarrassment, letting her select what she needed. A nightgown of soft flannel. Catherine watched in amazement as the pile on the counter grew. "This is too much," she protested. "I cannot ask you to spend so much. You are not asking, I am giving." Yates added a sewing kit to the pile, then some wrapped soap that smelled of lavender. "You will need these things. The ranch is isolated. We do not come to town often." When Homer tallied the bill, Catherine saw it was more than $20, a staggering sum. Yates paid without hesitation, counting out coins and bills from a leather pouch. They loaded everything onto the pack mule along with Yates's supplies. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, ammunition, and various other necessities. As they prepared to leave, Yates paused. "Can you ride?" Catherine shook her head. "I have never learned." "Then you will ride with me." He swung up onto his bay horse and reached down for her. Catherine hesitated only a moment before taking his hand. He pulled her up with surprising ease, settling her sideways in front of him. His arm came around her waist to hold her steady, and Catherine felt the strength in him, the solidity. It should have been uncomfortable, this sudden intimacy with a stranger, but instead she felt safe. They rode north out of Green River, following a well-worn trail that cut through sagebrush and grassland. The landscape was unlike anything Catherine had ever known, vast and empty and beautiful in a stark way that made her chest ache. The mountains loomed larger with every mile, and she could see the green line of a river cutting through the valley to the east. "That is the Green River," Yates said, his voice rumbling against her back. "It runs through my property, never goes dry, even in high summer. That is why I chose this land. How long have you been here?" 7 years. I came west after the war. Catherine did some mental arithmetic. That would have made him very young during the war, perhaps a boy soldier in its final years. She wanted to ask but sensed it was not the time. Instead she asked, "Is the ranch large?" 800 acres. Not the biggest, but it is good land. I run cattle, about 200 head, some horses. I have been building it up slowly, doing most of the work myself. You have no hired hands, cannot afford them yet. I had a hired man for a while, old fellow named Samuel, but he died last winter. Heart gave out. Yates was quiet for a moment. That is when I decided to find a wife. The loneliness was becoming too much. His honesty touched her. I understand loneliness, Catherine said softly. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic movement of the horse and the warmth of Yates's presence lulling Catherine into a strange contentment despite her exhaustion. The sun was beginning to lower, painting the western sky in shades of gold and pink, when she saw a cluster of buildings ahead. The ranch house was a simple structure of rough-hewn logs, with a covered porch and a stone chimney rising from one end. It was small but well-maintained, with shutters on the windows and a solid door. Near it stood a barn, larger than the house, and several corrals. A windmill turned lazily in the breeze, pumping water into a trough where cattle grazed in a nearby pasture. "Home," Yates said, and there was pride in his voice despite the ranch's modest appearance. He helped her down, then quickly tended to his horse and the mule, unloading supplies with efficient movements. Catherine stood uncertainly, not knowing what to do or where to go. When Yates finished, he gathered her packages and nodded toward the house. "Come on, I will show you inside." The interior was dim and cool, surprisingly neat for a bachelor's dwelling. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a wood stove, a table and chairs, and a worn sofa near a stone fireplace. Yates set her packages on the table and lit an oil lamp, bringing warm light to the space. "There is one bedroom," he said, gesturing to a doorway. "I will sleep out here on the sofa until we are married proper." Catherine felt relief flood through her, though she had not wanted to ask. "Thank you. There is a preacher who comes through Green River once a month. He will be back in 2 weeks. If that suits you, we can marry then." "That suits me." Yates showed her where things were. The pump for water, the outhouse a short walk from the main building, the root cellar stocked with preserved vegetables and smoked meat. He cooked a simple supper of beans and cornbread, apologizing for his limited skills. "I am not much of a cook," he admitted as they sat at the table. "Mostly I just eat to stay alive." "I can cook," Catherine offered. "My mother taught me. I can take over the kitchen if you would like." "I would like that very much." They ate in companionable silence, stealing glances at each other across the table. In the lamplight, Catherine could see the lines of weariness around Yates's eyes, the evidence of years of hard labor and harder loneliness. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A thin woman with dark hair and eyes too large for her face, wearing a travel-stained dress, bringing nothing to this union but herself. After supper, Yates showed her to the bedroom. It was Spartan but clean, with a brass bed covered in quilts, a chest of drawers, and a small washstand. He brought in her packages and set them down. "I will let you rest," he said. "You must be exhausted. If you need anything, I will be right outside." "Yates," Catherine said as he turned to go. He looked back and she struggled to find words adequate for what she felt. "Thank you for everything today, for your kindness." Something softened in his expression. "You took a chance on me, coming all this way to marry a stranger. The least I can do is be kind." After he left, Catherine changed into the new nightgown and lay down on the bed, which was more comfortable than anything she had slept on in months. Through the thin walls, she could hear Yates moving around, the creak of the sofa as he settled down. She stared at the dark ceiling, her mind reeling with the changes the day had brought. She had expected many things when she came west. Hardship, certainly, and struggle. Perhaps a harsh man worn bitter by frontier life, or a drunkard looking for someone to keep his house. Instead, she had found Yates Randolph, who looked at her with gentle eyes and said that everything he owned was hers. Catherine fell asleep with tears on her cheeks, but for the first time in years, they were not entirely tears of sorrow. Morning came early on a ranch. Catherine woke to the sound of Yates moving around outside, and pale dawn light filtering through the window. She dressed quickly in her old dress, knowing she would need to work on making new ones soon, and ventured out to the main room. Yates was gone, but he had left the fire going in the stove and a pot of coffee warming. She poured herself a cup and stood on the porch, sipping the strong, bitter brew and watching the ranch come alive in the morning light. Yates was in the nearest corral with the horses, his movements easy and confident. He saw her and raised a hand in greeting. Catherine explored the kitchen, finding it better stocked than she had expected. Yates had flour and cornmeal, dried beans and rice, a precious store of sugar and salt, jars of preserved vegetables, and smoked venison hanging in the root cellar. She set about making a proper breakfast, something more than the bachelor fare he had served last night. When Yates came in an hour later, the table was set with fried venison, eggs from hens she had discovered in a coop behind the house, biscuits and gravy. He stopped in the doorway, staring. "You did all this. I told you I could cook." He washed up at the basin and sat down, and Catherine felt a flush of pleasure at the obvious enjoyment on his face as he ate. "This is the best meal I have had in longer than I can remember," he said. "If you cook like this every day, I will be a happy man. I will need to learn what supplies you have and what you can obtain. I can do more with the right ingredients. Make a list. We will get whatever you need." After breakfast, Yates went out to work on his daily tasks, and Catherine began to make the house truly hers. She cleaned thoroughly, though Yates had kept things tidy. She organized the kitchen to her liking. She unpacked her few new belongings, taking pleasure in arranging them in the bedroom. Then she set to work on sewing, cutting fabric for a new work dress using her old one as a pattern. The days settled into a rhythm. Yates rose before dawn to tend the animals, fix fences, check on the herd. Catherine cooked and cleaned and sewed, gradually building herself a modest wardrobe. In the evenings they would sit together, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. Yates told her about the ranch, his plans for expanding the herd, the challenges of the climate and the market. Catherine told him about her life in Philadelphia, about losing her parents, about the cramped apartment and her aunt's cold charity. They were learning each other, she realized. Carefully, respectfully, like two cautious creatures circling closer. One evening about a week after her arrival, Yates came in from his work and found Catherine struggling to hang a pot that was too high for her to reach. He came up behind her, taking it from her hands and hung it easily on the hook. But he did not step away immediately. Catherine turned and found herself close enough to see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, close enough to smell the scent of sun and leather and honest sweat. "Catherine," he said quietly, "are you content here? Truly, if you are having regrets, I would understand." "I have no regrets," she said, and realized it was true. "Do you?" "No, none." His hand came up, hovering near her face but not quite touching. "I keep thinking I will wake up and find this is a dream, that you are not really here." "I am here," Catherine whispered. "I am real." His fingers brushed her cheek, feather light, and she saw desire flash in his eyes before he stepped back, clearing his throat. "The preacher will be in town this Saturday. We should go in early, get the license, and be married proper." "Yes," Catherine agreed, though her heart was pounding. That Saturday they rode into Green River together, Catherine seated in front of Yates as before. The preacher was a circuit rider named Reverend Thomas, a weathered man with kind eyes who performed the ceremony in the small church at the edge of town. There were no guests except Homer from the general store and his wife, who served as witnesses. Catherine wore the best dress she had been able to make in the time she had, a simple gray cotton that nonetheless fit her well. Yates had cleaned up and shaved, looking almost uncomfortable in a clean shirt and string tie. When Reverend Thomas asked if he took Catherine for his wife, Yates's "I do" was firm and clear. Catherine's response was quieter but no less certain. The kiss that sealed their vows was brief and chaste, but Catherine felt the tremble in Yates's hands as they held hers. They had a modest wedding meal at the boarding house, paid for by Yates despite his usual thrift. Then they purchased a few supplies and headed back to the ranch, arriving in the late afternoon. Everything looked the same, but everything was different. Catherine was no longer a guest in this house. She was Yates's wife. This was her home. They saw to the animals together, working side by side in the barn. Catherine was learning the rhythms of ranch work, the care of horses and cattle and chickens. She was stronger than she looked, Yates had discovered, and willing to work hard. When they finished, dusk was falling. They went inside and Catherine lit the lamps while Yates added wood to the stove. The domesticity of it struck her suddenly. They were a married couple performing the simple tasks of evening. Yates seemed to feel it too. He stood by the fireplace, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Catherine, I do not want you to feel pressured. About tonight, we can take our time." She appreciated his consideration, but the truth was that over the past 2 weeks, something had been growing between them. A warmth, an attraction, a genuine affection. When she looked at this man who had taken her in with nothing but kindness, who worked himself to exhaustion every day to build a life, who looked at her as though she were something precious, she felt her heart stir in ways it never had before. "I am your wife," she said softly, "in every way." The heat in his eyes was immediate and intense. He crossed to her in 3 strides, cupping her face in his rough hands. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering, Catherine rose on her toes and kissed him. The kiss started gently but quickly deepened, weeks of careful restraint finally breaking. Yates pulled her close, one hand tangling in her hair, and Catherine felt desire flood through her body. She had never known a man before, had never wanted to, but she wanted Yates with a fierceness that surprised her. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the bedroom, laying her on the bed with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. In the golden lamplight, they undressed each other slowly, learning the landscape of skin and muscle and softness. Yates was patient despite his obvious hunger, taking his time, making sure she felt pleasure along with the pain of first joining. Catherine clung to him, overwhelmed by sensation and emotion. When it was over, they lay tangled together, and Yates pulled the quilts over them both. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I know it is soon, but I do. I love you, Catherine." "I love you too," she replied, and knew it for truth. The weeks that followed were the happiest Catherine had ever known. She and Yates fell into their life together with an ease that seemed miraculous. They worked side by side during the day, she in the house and garden she was cultivating, he with the livestock and land. In the evenings, they would talk or read aloud from the few books Yates owned. At night, they learned each other's bodies with increasing confidence and joy. The isolated ranch, which Catherine had worried might feel like a prison, instead felt like a sanctuary. Just the two of them against the vast Wyoming wilderness, building something together. But the wilderness could be harsh, and sanctuary was not the same as safety. It was late October when the first snow came, earlier than Yates had hoped. He spent long days moving the cattle to winter pasture and making sure all the buildings were sound. Catherine helped where she could, learning to throw hay and break ice on water troughs. Then one afternoon, Yates rode out to check on a section of fence in the far pasture and did not return at his usual time. Catherine tried not to worry at first. He was often delayed by small crises, a cow in difficulty, a fence needing more extensive repair than expected. But as dusk fell and then full dark, fear crept in. She lit every lamp in the house and kept the porch lantern burning bright. She stood outside despite the cold, straining to hear hoofbeats, nothing but wind and the distant howl of coyotes. It was fully night and Catherine was near panic when she finally heard the slow clop of horse hooves. She ran toward the sound, lantern held high, and saw Yates's bay horse limping into the yard. Yates was slumped in the saddle, barely conscious. "Yates!" She reached him as he half fell from the horse. He was icy cold, and in the lamplight she saw blood on his leg. "Horse stepped in a hole," he mumbled. "Got thrown. Leg is hurt." Catherine got her shoulder under his arm and helped him into the house, terrified by how heavily he leaned on her. She got him to the sofa and carefully cut away his trouser leg, revealing an ugly gash on his thigh. It had bled considerably, but did not appear deep enough to be fatal. She heated water and cleaned the wound as best she could, her hands surprisingly steady despite her fear. Yates had passed out, which was perhaps a mercy. She stitched the gash closed using the sewing kit, remembering lessons from her mother about caring for her father's occasional injuries. Then she bandaged it tightly and covered Yates with every blanket she could find. She tended the bay horse, finding it had pulled up lame but not seriously injured, then returned to Yates. He was feverish now, shivering despite the blankets. Catherine spent the night bathing his face with cool cloths, forcing water between his lips, praying to a God she was not sure was listening. By morning, the fever had broken. Yates opened his eyes, focusing on her with difficulty. "Catherine, I am here. You are going to be fine," was foolish. Should have been more careful. "Hush. Save your strength." She made him broth and got him to drink it, then helped him to the bedroom where he would be more comfortable. The next few days were difficult. Yates could not put weight on his injured leg, and the ranch work could not stop. Catherine found herself doing tasks she had never imagined, feeding and watering all the animals, throwing hay to the cattle, chopping wood. She was exhausted to the bone, but she kept going. This was her home, her life, and Yates was her husband. She would do whatever was necessary. Yates chafed at his confinement but had to admit he could not work. He directed Catherine as best he could, telling her what needed to be done and how. She proved remarkably capable, attacking each task with determination. "You are stronger than you look," he said one evening, watching her collapse into a chair by the fire. "I have to be," Catherine replied. "We are all we have." The simple truth of it hung between them. They were isolated here, dependent entirely on each other. But instead of being frightening, Catherine found it oddly comforting. She knew Yates would do anything for her, and she would do the same for him. When he was well enough to move around with a crutch, Yates started helping with what tasks he could. Together, they kept the ranch functioning through the early winter. By the time Christmas approached, he was walking normally again, though he still favored the leg when tired. Christmas on the ranch was simple but meaningful. Catherine made a special supper from their dwindling supplies, and they exchanged modest gifts. She gave him a new shirt she had sewn, and he gave her a music box he had ordered from a catalog months before, thinking of the wife he hoped to find. The tinkling melody was the most beautiful sound Catherine had heard in years. That night, warm in each other's arms, Yates said, This has been the best Christmas of my life." "Mine too," Catherine agreed. The winter was hard, as Yates had warned. Days were short and cold, nights were bitter, and storms would sometimes keep them housebound for days at a time. But Catherine did not mind. The small house felt cozy, and there was something intimate about being snowbound together. Just the two of them in their small, warm bubble while the world raged outside. She read to him from the Bible and the novels and agricultural journals that were his only books. He taught her to play chess with a set carved from wood. They talked for hours, sharing histories and dreams, and they made love with increasing passion, learning all the ways to bring each other pleasure. By February, Catherine was certain she was pregnant. She waited another month to be sure before telling Yates. She had wanted to pick the perfect moment, but in the end, it came out one morning over breakfast when waves of nausea forced her to run outside. Yates followed, finding her retching behind the house. Concern filled his face. "Catherine, what is wrong? Are you ill?" She wiped her mouth, standing up shakily. "Not ill. At least, not in the way you mean. Yates, I am going to have a baby." He stared at her for a long moment, and Catherine felt a flash of worry. They had never discussed children. Perhaps he did not want them, or not yet. But then his face broke into a smile of pure joy, and he swept her into his arms, spinning her around. "A baby, Catherine, truly, truly. In the autumn, I think. September or October." He set her down carefully, suddenly treating her like fragile glass. "You should not be working so hard. You need to rest." "I am pregnant, not broken," she laughed. "I can still work, just maybe not the heaviest chores." Yates became absurdly protective, insisting on doing tasks Catherine was perfectly capable of handling. She found it endearing even when it was frustrating. He was so obviously excited about becoming a father, so tender in his care of her. As spring came and the snow melted, revealing the greening land beneath, Catherine's belly began to swell. Yates would place his hand on it in the evenings, marveling at the life growing within. When the baby began to kick, he would talk to it, telling it about the ranch and the horses and all the things they would do together. "What if it is a girl?" Catherine teased. "Then I will teach her to ride and rope with the best of them," Yates replied. "And God help any man who tries to court her without my approval." The summer was busy. Yates hired a drifter to help with the work for a few weeks, a young cowboy passing through so that he could focus on preparations for the baby. He built a cradle from pine, sanding it smooth and carving horses into the headboard. Catherine sewed tiny clothes and blankets, working when the heat was not too oppressive. In August, they made the trip to Green River, now very difficult for Catherine with her swollen belly. They bought supplies that would see them through the birth and after. The storekeeper's wife, a practical woman named Martha, offered to come help when Catherine's time came. "You send word when her pains start," Martha instructed Yates. "I will ride out straight away." But when Catherine's labor began in late September, it came fast. She woke Yates in the early morning hours, and by the time he could have ridden for help, it was too late. "I cannot leave you," Yates said, fear naked on his face. "What if something goes wrong?" "Then you will handle it," Catherine gasped through a contraction. "You must. There is no choice." Yates had delivered calves and foals, but never a human baby. Still, he boiled water and gathered clean linens and helped Catherine through the long hours of labor with steady hands and encouraging words. When she screamed with the pain, he held her. When she was sure she could not go on, he told her she could. And when, in the afternoon, their son finally slipped into the world, Yates caught him with shaking hands and placed him on Catherine's chest. "A boy," Yates whispered, tears streaming down his face. "We have a son." The baby was perfect, small but healthy, with a strong cry in his father's dark hair. Catherine held him, exhausted and overwhelmed and more in love than she had known possible. "What should we name him?" she asked. Yates looked at the tiny face, then at Catherine. "What was your father's name?" "Thomas. Thomas Randolph. It is a good name." They spent the next hours marveling at their son, counting his fingers and toes, laughing at his expressions. Yates proved surprisingly adept at swaddling and diapering, and his gentleness with the baby made Catherine fall in love with him all over again. When Martha arrived the next day, having heard in town that Catherine's time was near, she found mother and baby both doing well, with a very exhausted but proud father keeping watch over them. "Well," Martha said approvingly, "looks like you managed just fine without me." The autumn was a blur of sleepless nights and the steep learning curve of new parenthood. But Yates and Catherine navigated it together, taking turns walking a fussy baby, laughing at their own ignorance and celebrating each small milestone. Little Thomas was an easy baby, generally content unless hungry or wet. As the months passed, he grew chubby and alert, his gray eyes taking in the world with interest. Yates would carry him around the ranch, showing him the horses and cattle, talking to him about everything as though he could understand. Catherine watched her husband with their son and felt her heart could hold no more love. The winter of Thomas's first year was milder than the last, and by spring, Yates was making plans to expand the ranch. The cattle had done well, and he had saved carefully. He hired 2 seasonal hands to help with the spring work, which allowed him more time with Catherine and Thomas. One evening in May, sitting on the porch and watching Thomas crawl on a blanket, Yates said, "I have been thinking. We should build a bigger house. This one is too small for a growing family." "A growing family," Catherine repeated. "Yates, are you already planning more children?" He grinned. "Well, maybe. If you are willing. But regardless, we need more room. Thomas will not fit in a cradle much longer, and we could use a separate bedroom for him. Maybe 2 bedrooms in case we are blessed with more children." They spent the summer planning the new house, a larger structure that would be built nearby. Yates hired a carpenter from Green River, and by autumn, the frame was up. It would have a proper parlor, a kitchen with a new stove, 3 bedrooms, and even a small office for Yates to keep his ranch records. As the house took shape, Catherine found herself pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Yates was no less protective but more confident. Thomas, now walking and getting into everything, provided plenty of distraction from the discomforts of pregnancy. The new house was finished in February, and they moved in with great excitement. Catherine loved having space, loved the luxury of a house built for a family rather than a bachelor. Yates installed the music box in the parlor, and its tinkling melody filled the new rooms with sweetness. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose, was born in April in the new house's main bedroom. This time, Martha was present, and the birth was quicker and easier. Rose had her mother's dark eyes and a head full of black hair. She was a more demanding baby than Thomas had been, but Yates doted on her completely. 2 children, he marveled one night, holding Rose while Thomas slept against Catherine's shoulder. 2 years ago, I was alone in that little house, wondering if I would spend my whole life solitary. Now look at this. A wife I love more than my own life, a son and a daughter. How did I become so fortunate? We are both fortunate, Catherine said. I came here with nothing and you gave me everything. You gave me far more than I gave you, Yates insisted. You gave me a family. A purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me joy. The years that followed were full and rich. The ranch prospered under Yates's careful management. They added to the herd, improved the facilities, and even bought an adjacent property when it became available. Yates hired permanent hands, a young couple who lived in the old ranch house and helped with both the livestock and the children. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ways of the ranch. Rose was spirited and fearless, insisting she could do everything her brother did. When she was 3, Catherine gave birth to twins, another boy and girl. Yates named them Samuel after his old hired man, and Catherine chose Grace for their daughter. The house that had seemed so spacious was now filled with the noise and chaos of 4 children. Catherine's days were busy from dawn to dusk, but she thrived on it. She had found her calling in motherhood and in being Yates's partner in building this life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Yates took Catherine to Green River for a rare night away. The children stayed with the hired couple, and Yates booked them a room at the boarding house, which now seemed almost luxurious compared to their first years. They had dinner at the town's new restaurant, dressed in their best clothes. Catherine wore a dress of deep blue, the finest she had ever owned, and Yates wore a suit that made him look almost uncomfortable. He was so used to ranch wear. "I was thinking," Yates said over dessert, "about the day you arrived, how you stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but the clothes on your back. How terrified I was that you would take one look at me and my poor little ranch and get right back on that stage." "I was terrified too," Catherine admitted. "I thought you would be disappointed in me, that you had expected someone prettier or more accomplished." Yates reached across the table and took her hand. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen, and you are accomplished at the only things that matter. You made a house a home. You gave me children. You stand beside me through every hardship." He paused, his gray eyes intense in the lamplight. "I meant what I said that first day, Catherine. Everything I own is yours. But the truth is, everything I am is yours too, my heart, my soul, my every breath. I am yours completely." Catherine felt tears slip down her cheeks. "And I am yours. I love you, Yates, more now than ever." That night, in the privacy of their rented room, they made love with the passion of newlyweds and the deep intimacy of a decade of partnership. Catherine marveled that desire had not faded with time and familiarity, but had instead grown richer, deeper, more profound. The next morning they rode back to the ranch, eager to be reunited with their children. As the house came into view, Yates pulled his horse to a stop on a small rise, and Catherine looked at the scene spread before them. The house stood solid and welcoming, smoke rising from its chimney. The barn and corrals were well maintained, the fences straight and strong. Cattle grazed in the pastures, fat and healthy, and in the yard she could see the children playing under the watchful eye of the hired woman. "Look at what we built," Yates said softly. "Together." Catherine leaned back against him, feeling his arms come around her. "It is a good life, the best life." They rode down to the house, and the children came running to greet them. Thomas, now 10, had grown tall and lean like his father. Rose at 8 was all energy and laughter. The twins at 5 were still babyish but developing distinct personalities. Samuel quiet and watchful, Grace bold and affectionate. Catherine gathered them close, breathing in the scent of their hair, feeling the solid warmth of their bodies. This was what she had been meant for. This was home. The years continued to pass, marked by the usual joys and sorrows of life. One of their horses died, which devastated Rose. A drought year tested their resources, but they survived it. Thomas began to court a girl from a neighboring ranch, which made Yates grumble about his son growing up too fast. Rose announced she wanted to be a veterinarian, which was almost unheard of for a woman, but both Catherine and Yates encouraged her dreams. When Catherine was 42, she realized she was pregnant again, a surprise at her age. She worried about complications, but Yates was thrilled. "One more blessing," he said, and she could not help but smile at his joy. This pregnancy was harder than the others, and the birth was difficult. But in the end, she delivered a healthy boy they named John, after Yates's father who had died before Yates came west. The older children were delighted with the baby, fighting over who got to hold him. "A baby in the house again," Yates said, rocking John while Catherine rested. "I had thought we were done with diapers and midnight feedings." "Are you complaining?" Catherine asked. "Not for a moment. Every child is a gift." As John grew, the older children began to leave. Thomas married his sweetheart and started his own ranch on land Yates helped him buy. Rose went east to veterinary school, one of only a handful of women in her class, with her parents' full support and pride. The twins were still at home but growing quickly. Samuel following in Thomas's footsteps with the ranch, Grace planning to become a teacher. The house that had once been so full grew quieter. Catherine felt the bittersweet ache of watching her children fly, but she was proud of them. She and Yates had given them strong foundations and let them build their own lives upon them. When John was 10, Catherine and Yates celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. They had a big gathering at the ranch. With all the children and grandchildren, Thomas and his wife had 3 children now, and Rose had married a fellow veterinarian and had twins of her own. Looking around at the family filling the house and spilling out onto the porch and yard, Catherine felt a profound sense of gratitude. 25 years ago, she had been a destitute woman with no prospects, stepping off a stagecoach into an uncertain future. Now she was surrounded by love. That evening, after the guests had left and John was in bed, Catherine and Yates walked out to look at the stars. The Wyoming sky was vast and brilliant, the Milky Way a river of light overhead. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had not answered my advertisement?" Yates asked. Catherine considered. "Sometimes, but I cannot imagine anything better than this." "Neither can I." He pulled her close, and they stood in comfortable silence, bodies aligned from years of holding each other this way. "I think," Catherine said eventually, "that we were meant to find each other, that everything in my life, as hard as it was, led me to that stagecoach, to Green River, to you. I think you are right, and I thank God for it every single day." They grew old together on the ranch, still working though not as hard, with hired help to do the heavy labor. Samuel took over most of the ranch operations in his 20s, running it with his father's wisdom and his own innovations. Grace did become a teacher, starting a school in Green River that served ranch families for miles around. Rose visited when she could, always bringing her latest veterinary journals to discuss with her father. Thomas's children grew up, and then his grandchildren. The Randolph Ranch became known throughout Wyoming as a model operation, but more than that, it was known as a place of warmth and family. Catherine's kitchen was always open, her table always welcoming. When Yates was 68, he had a stroke while out checking fences. Samuel found him and got him back to the house, where Catherine nursed him with fierce determination. He recovered most of his functions, but the stroke aged him, made him slower and more fragile. Catherine, now 60 for herself, felt her own mortality more acutely, but she was not afraid. She had lived a full life, had loved deeply and been loved in return. They sat together on the porch more often now, watching the sunset paint the mountains. Yates's hand would find hers, still seeking her touch after all these years. "You remember what I said to you that first day?" he asked one evening. "When you told me you had nothing, you said everything you owned was mine. And I meant it. But Catherine, the truth is, you owned me from that moment. My heart was yours before I even knew your face, and it will be yours until I draw my last breath and beyond." "And mine is yours," Catherine whispered, "always and forever." Yates lived for 5 more years after his stroke, years of quiet contentment surrounded by his family. When he died peacefully in his sleep at 73, Catherine held his hand and whispered her love one last time. She mourned him deeply, but did not regret a single day of their life together. She stayed on at the ranch, cared for by Samuel and his wife, visited constantly by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. On what would have been their 40th wedding anniversary, Catherine went to Yates's grave on the hill overlooking the ranch. She sat there in the autumn sunshine, feeling the warmth on her face, and talked to him as though he were still beside her. "We did well, did we not?" she said. "We built something lasting, not just the ranch but a family, a legacy of love." A breeze stirred the grass and Catherine smiled. She could almost feel Yates's hand in hers, could almost hear his voice saying, "Yes, we did well." She lived to be 84, dying peacefully in the house Yates had built for her, surrounded by 3 generations of the family they had created together. Her last words were his name. They buried her beside Yates on the hill. The double headstone read, "Yates and Catherine Randolph." Together they built a home, together they built a family, together forever. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations. And though the story of how it all began faded into family legend, the descendants of Yates and Catherine Randolph never forgot the essential truth at the heart of their family's founding. That true love comes not from what you possess, but from what you are willing to give. That home is not a place but the people you choose. And that the greatest riches are found in devotion and partnership, and the courage to build a life together from nothing but hope and determination and love. In the end, the mail-order bride who arrived with no belongings and the rancher who said everything he owned was hers had given each other the one thing that truly mattered. A love that lasted a lifetime and echoed through generations. A love that turned an empty house into a home and built an empire not of land or cattle but of family, connection, and enduring devotion. They had taken the enormous risk of trusting strangers, of reaching across distance for connection, and they had been rewarded with everything that makes life worth living. Their story became a testament to the power of taking chances on love, of keeping promises, of choosing each other every single day through hardship and joy alike, and of building something beautiful together that would outlast them both and stand as proof that true love, the kind that weathers all storms and grows stronger with time, is not only possible but worth every sacrifice, every struggle, every moment of doubt.